My daughter-in-law handed me my inheritance with a smile so calm, so certain, that for a moment I wondered if I was the only one who didn't understand what was happening. The envelope was thin, too thin to hold the life my husband and I had built over 42 years. I held it between my fingers, feeling the crisp edge of the paper inside, and I remember thinking how strange it was that something so light could carry so much weight. Around me, the lawyer's office was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels rehearsed, like everyone already knows their part. My son Daniel sat across from me, his hands folded, his gaze fixed somewhere just past my shoulder. He didn't look at me. Not once. Sophia sat beside him, perfectly composed, her posture straight, her expression soft in a way that didn't reach her eyes. When I finally opened the envelope, I didn't react. I made sure of that. Inside was a single document, neatly printed, outlining what they called my portion. A modest monthly allowance. No mention of the house. No mention of the savings account Harold and I had carefully built, dollar by dollar, over decades. No mention of the lake property he loved so much. Just a number. A small one. Small enough that I read it twice, just to be certain I wasn't mistaken. It's simpler this way, Sophia said gently, her voice smooth, practiced. Less for you to worry about. I nodded slowly, folding the paper back into the envelope with steady hands. I could feel Daniel watching me now, waiting for something. Anger, maybe, or confusion, but I gave him neither. Thank you, I said, and I even managed a small smile. The kind of smile that reassures people. The kind that makes them believe everything is exactly as it should be. The meeting ended shortly after that. Papers were signed. Hands were shaken. Sophia gathered her things with quiet efficiency, her fingers brushing Daniel's arm in a gesture that looked affectionate but felt deliberate. As we walked out of the building, the late afternoon sun hit my face, warm but distant, like it belonged to someone else's life. Daniel finally spoke. "Mom, this is for the best," he said, his tone careful, measured. I looked at him then, really looked at him, and for a brief second, I saw the boy he used to be, the one who used to reach for my hand without thinking. But that moment passed quickly. "Of course," I replied. "You've always made good decisions." Sophia smiled at that, a small, satisfied curve of her lips, and I tucked that detail away, just like I tucked away the envelope into my purse. Because something wasn't right. I didn't need to raise my voice to know it. I didn't need to argue to feel it. It was there, in the silence between their words, in the way Daniel avoided my eyes, in the way Sophia had already decided how this story would end. But they had made one mistake. They thought I would accept what I was given without looking any closer. And as I stood there, holding that thin envelope, I realized I didn't need to understand everything yet. I just needed to start paying attention. I did not open the envelope again that evening. Instead, I placed it carefully on the kitchen counter, right beside the ceramic bowl Harold and I had bought during a summer trip to Vermont nearly 20 years ago. The house felt different without him, not just quieter, but hollow in a way that echoed through every room. The refrigerator hummed too loudly. The clock on the wall ticked with a sharpness I had never noticed before, and the chair across from mine at the dining table sat untouched, as if it were waiting for someone who was not coming back. I made myself a cup of tea out of habit, measuring the water, waiting for it to boil, pouring it into the same mug I had used for years, but I did not drink it. It sat there, steam slowly fading, just like everything else that used to feel certain. I thought about the meeting again, about the way Sophia had spoken, about the way Daniel had not. It was not what they said that stayed with me. It was what they left out. Harold had always been meticulous with our finances. Every account, every property, every investment was documented, organized, and explained. He used to joke that if anything ever happened to him, I would know exactly where every dollar was and why. And I had believed him. I had trusted that the life we built together was something solid, something that could not simply disappear into a single sheet of paper labeled my portion. I walked to the living room and sat in his chair, the leather still worn in the shape of him, and I let myself remember. The late nights when we reviewed bank statements together, the weekends we spent discussing whether to refinance the lake property, the quiet pride in his voice when he talked about leaving something meaningful behind for me. Harold was not careless. He was not the kind of man who would leave me with so little, not without an explanation, not without making sure I understood. That thought settled into me slowly, like a stone sinking to the bottom of clear water. Something was missing. I stood up and went to the drawer where we kept our old files. It took me a few minutes to find the folder labeled in Harold's neat handwriting, but when I did, I felt a small, steady sense of clarity return. Inside were copies of documents, older statements, notes written in the margins in blue ink. I spread them out across the table, one by one, not rushing, not panicking, just observing. The numbers did not match what I had been given earlier that day. Not even close. There were accounts listed here that had not been mentioned at all. Investments that had simply vanished from the narrative Sophia had presented so carefully. I traced my finger along one of the entries, reading it again, making sure I was not imagining things. I was not. The more I looked, the clearer it became. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not a simple adjustment or a harmless oversight. This was something deliberate. I leaned back in the chair and folded my hands in my lap, letting the realization settle fully. Daniel's silence. Sophia's confidence. The thin envelope. It all fit together now, not as separate moments, but as pieces of the same design. And yet, I did not feel the urge to call them, to confront them, to demand answers. That would have been too easy, too predictable. Instead, I gathered the papers slowly, aligning the edges, placing them back into the folder exactly as I had found them. Then I returned the folder to the drawer and closed it gently. The envelope remained on the counter where I had left it, untouched, almost insignificant now compared to what I knew. I turned off the kitchen light and stood there for a moment in the dim glow coming from the hallway, listening to the quiet house, feeling something shift inside me. Not anger, not even sadness. Something steadier than that. Something patient. They believed the story was already written. They believed I would accept my place in it without question. But they had forgotten one very important thing. I had been there from the beginning, and I remembered everything. The next morning, I woke before the sun had fully risen, the house still wrapped in that quiet gray light that makes everything feel suspended, as if time itself has not decided to move forward yet. I did not rush. I made my bed the way I always had, smoothing the sheets, adjusting the pillows, maintaining the small rituals that had shaped my life for decades. There was comfort in that consistency, even now. When I walked into the kitchen, the envelope was still there, exactly where I had left it, untouched and waiting. I glanced at it only briefly before turning my attention to something else. Coffee. 2 scoops of ground beans, 6 cups of water, the soft gurgle of the machine beginning its cycle. Harold used to say that a good morning started with a good cup of coffee. I wondered what he would say now. By the time the coffee was ready, I had already made my decision. Not a loud one. Not the kind that demands attention. Just a quiet, steady choice to begin looking closer, one step at a time. I sat at the table with my mug and a notepad, the same yellow legal pad Harold had always preferred. I wrote down everything I could remember from the day before. The numbers on the document. The accounts that were missing. The way Sophia had phrased certain things. Less for you to worry about. I underlined that sentence once, then set the pen down. It was not concern. It was control. After breakfast, I dressed carefully, choosing a simple navy cardigan and a pair of slacks. Nothing that would draw attention, nothing that would suggest anything out of the ordinary. When I stepped outside, the air was crisp, carrying that early hint of autumn that Harold had always loved. The drive to the bank took 15 minutes, the same route I had taken countless times before, but today, I noticed things I usually ignored. The way the light hit the storefront windows, the sound of tires on pavement, the rhythm of a world continuing as if nothing had changed. Inside the bank, everything felt familiar. The polished floors, the quiet hum of conversation, the faint scent of paper and ink. I approached the front desk and gave my name, my voice calm, steady, practiced. The young woman behind the counter smiled politely and asked how she could help. I would like to review my accounts, I said, choosing each word carefully. Not a question, not a request, a statement. She nodded and began typing, her fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. For a moment, everything seemed routine. Then her expression shifted, just slightly. It was subtle, but I saw it. A pause. A second look at the screen. Is everything all right? I asked gently, as if I had not already anticipated this moment. She hesitated, then offered a professional smile. There have been some recent changes to your accounts, Mrs. Whitmore. I will need to bring in my manager to assist you. I nodded, as though this were perfectly expected, and folded my hands in my lap. When the manager arrived, he introduced himself and sat across from me, his tone respectful but cautious. He explained that several accounts had been consolidated, that certain authorizations had been updated, that funds had been transferred according to signed instructions. Signed instructions. I listened without interrupting, without reacting, letting him finish every sentence. "May I see the documents?" I asked. He agreed and stepped away briefly, returning with a folder that looked far too official to contain something so simple. When he placed it in front of me, I opened it slowly, my fingers steady, my breathing even. The signature at the bottom of the first page was mine, or at least it looked like mine. The same looping letters, the same careful stroke at the end. But as I studied it more closely, I noticed something small. A hesitation in the line, a slight inconsistency in the pressure. It was convincing, very convincing, but it was not written by my hand. I closed the folder gently and looked up at the manager, offering a calm, appreciative smile. "Thank you for showing me this," I said. "I believe I understand now." And in that moment, I did. Not everything. Not yet. But enough. Enough to know that what had been taken from me was not done by accident and not done alone. Enough to know that this was only the beginning. I did not argue with the bank manager, and I did not ask him to explain anything further because there was nothing he could say that would change what I had already seen. Instead, I thanked him again, closed the folder, and stood up with the same calm composure I had carried into the building. Outside, the sunlight felt sharper than it had that morning, as if the world had quietly shifted while I was inside. I sat in my car for a moment before starting the engine, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, not trembling, not tense, just still. The signature had been convincing, almost perfect, but I had signed my name thousands of times over the years, on checks, on documents, on birthday cards and anniversary notes, and I knew the rhythm of it, the pressure, the way the pen moved without hesitation. What I saw in that folder was an imitation. Careful, deliberate, and practiced, but not mine. That meant someone had taken the time to study it. Someone who had access to my documents, to my records, to my life. As I drove home, I began to replay the past few months, not as memories, but as evidence. Small moments I had dismissed at the time now returned with a different weight. The afternoon Sophia had offered to help me organize paperwork after Harold's passing, insisting it would take the burden off my shoulders. The way she had sat at the dining table, sorting through files with quiet efficiency, occasionally asking me to sign something while she explained it in simple terms, always with that same reassuring smile. I had trusted her, not blindly, but enough. Enough to sign without reading every line. Enough to believe she was helping rather than guiding something in a direction I had not chosen. I parked in the driveway and sat there for a few seconds longer, letting that realization settle into place. It was not one moment. It was a series of them, carefully arranged, each one small enough to seem harmless on its own, but together forming something much larger. When I stepped inside the house, the silence greeted me again, but it no longer felt empty. It felt watchful. I walked to the kitchen and picked up the envelope, holding it in my hands as if it were a piece of evidence rather than an answer. The number printed inside it was not just insufficient. It was intentional. It was designed to make me accept less without questioning why. I placed it back down on the counter and moved toward the hallway, stopping briefly at the mirror. The woman looking back at me did not appear confused or broken. Her expression was composed, her posture steady, her eyes clear in a way they had not been the day before. I turned away and went to the study, the room Harold had always used for his paperwork, his notes, his quiet planning. The desk was exactly as he had left it, neat and orderly, a reflection of the way he had lived his life. I sat down in his chair and opened the drawer where he kept his personal files, the ones he rarely needed but never misplaced. Inside, I found what I was looking for. Not a single document, but a pattern. Copies of signatures, reference sheets, notes about account structures, reminders written in his careful handwriting. He had always believed in preparation, in making sure that nothing important was left unclear. As I flipped through the pages, I realized something else. Harold had anticipated confusion, even conflict, but he had also left a trail, a way for me to follow if I ever needed to understand the full picture. I closed the drawer slowly and leaned back in the chair, letting the weight of that knowledge settle. This was not just about money. It was about control, about rewriting a story that did not belong to them. And they had counted on one thing above all else: that I would not question it, that I would not look closely enough to see what had been changed, what had been taken, what had been quietly rewritten in their favor. I folded my hands on the desk and allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible smile. Not because I found any of this amusing, but because for the first time since that meeting, I understood my position clearly. I was not behind. I was not lost. I was simply at the beginning of something they had already underestimated. The rest of the afternoon passed in a quiet rhythm, but it was no longer the kind of quiet that came from absence. It was deliberate now, filled with purpose, each moment measured, each thought placed carefully where it belonged. I did not rush to conclusions, and I did not allow myself the comfort of anger. Anger makes people careless, and carelessness was not something I could afford. Instead, I made a list, not on the same legal pad from the morning, but in a smaller notebook I kept tucked in the drawer of Harold's desk. Names, dates, small observations. The afternoon Sophia had come over unannounced with a folder already prepared. The evening Daniel had insisted on handling just a few remaining details, while I was in the kitchen making dinner. The documents I had signed without reading fully because I trusted the explanation given to me. Each memory felt different now, sharper, more defined, as if I were seeing it for the first time instead of remembering it. Around 3 o'clock, the phone rang. I let it ring twice before answering, not because I needed time, but because I wanted to control the pace of the conversation. It was Daniel. His voice was warm, almost overly so, the way people sound when they are trying to confirm that everything is still as they left it. "Mom, I just wanted to check in," he said. "Make sure you are doing all right after yesterday." I leaned back in the chair, letting my gaze rest on the window, on the quiet stretch of the backyard Harold had cared for so carefully. "I am fine," I replied, my tone steady, even. Everything was very clear. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, subtle but noticeable. "Good," he said finally. "Sophia was worried it might be overwhelming for you." I allowed a small smile, even though he could not see it. "She has always been very thoughtful," I said. Another pause, slightly longer this time, as if he were listening for something beneath my words, searching for any sign that I had begun to question the version of events they had presented. I gave him nothing. We spoke for a few more minutes about ordinary things, the weather, the house, a neighbor he had seen recently, and then the call ended as smoothly as it had begun. When I set the phone down, I did not feel relieved. I felt confirmed. They were watching carefully, waiting to see if I would remain within the boundaries they had created for me. That told me something important. They were not finished, which meant neither was I. Later that evening, I returned to the folder in the drawer and pulled out one of Harold's old contact lists. He had always kept records of the people he trusted, professionals he had worked with for years, individuals who understood not just the numbers, but the principles behind them. One name stood out immediately: Thomas Caldwell, his accountant for over 2 decades. A man Harold respected enough to consult before making any significant financial decision. I remembered meeting him only a handful of times, but each time he had been precise, observant, and, most importantly, discreet. I wrote down his number and closed the drawer, not calling immediately. Timing mattered. Acting too quickly would suggest urgency, and urgency could lead to mistakes. Instead, I prepared dinner, something simple, something familiar, allowing myself to move through the routine without distraction. The house was still quiet, but it no longer felt empty. It felt like a place where something was being built, slowly, carefully, just beneath the surface. After I finished eating, I washed the dishes and dried them one by one, placing each piece back exactly where it belonged. Order mattered. Clarity mattered. When everything was in its place, I returned to the study and picked up the phone. I dialed the number from memory, not looking at the paper again, and waited. It rang 3 times before a voice answered, older now, but still steady. "This is Thomas Caldwell." I did not introduce myself immediately. I let a second pass, just enough to ensure my voice would carry the right tone, calm, composed, unmistakably certain. "Thomas," I said, "this is Margaret Whitmore. I believe it is time we had a conversation about my husband's accounts." Thomas did not respond immediately, and for a brief moment, all I could hear was the faint static of the line, the kind that fills silence when something important is about to be said. Then his voice came back, slower now, more attentive. "Margaret," he said, and there was recognition in it, but also something else. Caution. "I was wondering when you might call." I did not react to that. I did not ask what he meant. Instead, I let the silence stretch, just enough to invite him to continue. "I assume this is about the recent changes," he added carefully. "The account consolidations, the transfers." I leaned back slightly in the chair, my fingers resting lightly against the edge of the desk. "I would prefer to understand exactly what those changes were," I said, my voice even measured. There was a pause on his end, longer this time, as if he were choosing his words with precision. "Margaret, under normal circumstances, I would have reached out sooner," he said. "But I was informed that all communication regarding your accounts was being handled directly through your son and his wife." I allowed myself a small, almost invisible nod. Of course, that explained the confidence. That explained the seamless way everything had been presented, as if it were already finalized, already beyond question. "And did that seem normal to you?" I asked quietly. Thomas exhaled softly. "No," he said. "It did not." That answer settled something inside me, not with force, but with clarity. I was no longer looking at fragments. I was beginning to see the structure. "I would like to meet," I said. "In person. I think that would be best," he replied without hesitation. "There are details that are not appropriate to discuss over the phone." We agreed on a time the following morning, and when the call ended, I did not move right away. I sat there, the receiver still in my hand for a second longer than necessary, letting the weight of the conversation settle into place. This was no longer a question of suspicion. It was confirmation. Not of every detail, not yet, but enough to know that what had been done was not only deliberate, it had been constructed with the expectation that I would remain uninvolved, that I would accept the version of events handed to me without seeking another perspective. I placed the phone back in its cradle and stood up slowly, walking toward the window. The sky outside had deepened into a soft evening blue, the kind that makes everything appear calmer than it truly is. The trees in the yard moved slightly in the breeze, their leaves shifting with a quiet, steady rhythm. Harold used to watch them in the evenings, sometimes without saying a word, just sitting there as if he understood something about the world that did not need to be spoken. I wondered, briefly, what he would have seen in all of this. Not the betrayal itself, but the pattern behind it. The intention, the planning, because that was what this was. Not a single decision, not a moment of poor judgment, but a sequence, carefully arranged, thought through. And that meant something else as well. It meant there would be records, Trace's decisions documented in ways they may not have fully considered. I turned away from the window and walked back to the desk, opening the notebook once more. I added a single line beneath the others. Thomas Caldwell questioned the changes. It was not a dramatic note, not a revelation, but it mattered, because it meant I was not the only one who had seen something that did not belong. I closed the notebook and placed it back in the drawer, aligning it with the others. Everything in its place. Everything accounted for. As I turned off the light and left the study, I felt that same steady shift inside me, the one that had begun earlier and was now becoming something more defined. They believed they had already finished this, that all that remained was for me to accept it. But they had overlooked something simple. The story was not over. Not yet. And for the first time since that envelope had been placed in my hands, I was no longer reacting to what they had done. I was preparing for what I would do next. The next morning arrived with a clarity that felt almost deliberate, as if the world itself had decided to remove any distractions that might cloud my thinking. I dressed the same way I always did for important meetings, not to impress anyone, but to remind myself of who I was. A tailored gray coat, low heels, a simple pearl necklace Harold had given me on our 30th anniversary. There was comfort in that choice, in the quiet strength of something familiar. The drive to Thomas Caldwell's office took a little over 20 minutes, and I arrived 10 minutes early, just as I had been taught to do many years ago. His office building stood in a part of town that had not changed much over the years, steady and understated, the kind of place where things were handled with care rather than display. Inside, the receptionist greeted me with a polite smile and asked me to wait. I sat down in one of the chairs near the window, my hands resting calmly in my lap, my posture straight, my breathing even. I was not nervous. I was focused. When Thomas finally appeared, he looked older than I remembered, but his eyes were the same. Observant. Careful. He extended his hand, and I took it briefly before following him into his office. The room was neat, almost precise, every document in its place, every surface clear. It reminded me of Harold's study, and for a moment, I felt that same quiet sense of alignment. Thomas closed the door behind us and gestured for me to sit. He did not begin with small talk. He did not ask how I had been. Instead, he sat across from me, folded his hands, and spoke directly. "Margaret, before I explain anything, I need to confirm something with you," he said. "Did you personally authorize the recent transfers and consolidations of your accounts?" I met his gaze without hesitation. "No," I said. "Just one word. Clear. Final." He nodded slowly, as if that answer confirmed what he had already suspected. Then he reached for a folder on his desk and opened it, turning it toward me so I could see. "These are the documents I was provided," he said. "They were submitted with your signature and accompanied by instructions to move assets into newly structured accounts under joint oversight." I looked down at the pages, recognizing the same imitation I had seen at the bank. The same careful attempt to replicate something personal, something specific. "Joint oversight," I repeated quietly. Thomas nodded. "Your son and his wife were listed as authorized co-managers on several of these accounts." I did not react outwardly, but inside, the structure became clearer. Not just access, control, legal, documented, and positioned in a way that made it appear legitimate. "And you were not contacted to verify this?" I asked. Thomas's expression tightened slightly. "I was informed that due to your recent loss, it would be more efficient for your family to handle these matters on your behalf," he said. "Under normal circumstances, I would not have accepted that without direct confirmation from you. But the documentation appeared complete, and the communication was consistent." Consistent. That word lingered. It meant coordination. It meant this was not a single decision, but a sequence of actions supported by a clear narrative they had presented to others. I leaned back slightly in my chair, allowing myself a moment to absorb the full picture without interruption. "What else?" I asked. Thomas hesitated for a brief second, then turned another page in the folder. "There is one more detail you should be aware of," he said. "A portion of the funds from your primary investment account was transferred into a separate entity approximately 6 weeks ago." 6 weeks. That was before the meeting, before the envelope, before everything had been presented to me as if it were already decided. "What kind of entity?" I asked. "A limited liability company," he replied. "Recently established." I held his gaze, waiting. "The registered manager is Sophia Whitmore." The room did not change. The light did not shift. Nothing dramatic happened, but something settled into place with a quiet, undeniable certainty. This had been planned. Not rushed. Not improvised. Planned. "I see," I said calmly. Thomas studied me for a moment, perhaps expecting a different reaction, something sharper, something more immediate. But I had no intention of giving that to him, or to anyone else. "What are my options?" I asked instead. His posture straightened slightly, as if this was the part he had been waiting for. "If these actions were taken without your informed consent, there are legal avenues to challenge them," he said. "But we will need to proceed carefully, with documentation, with timing, and with a clear understanding of the full scope." I nodded once, slowly, not because I needed reassurance, but because I understood exactly what that meant. This was no longer about discovering what had happened. It was about deciding how to respond. And as I sat there, looking at the documents spread across his desk, I realized something with absolute clarity. They had already made their move. Now it was my turn. When I left Thomas Caldwell's office, I did not feel overwhelmed, and I did not feel uncertain. The information had not shaken me. It had organized itself neatly into place, like pieces of a puzzle that had been waiting for the right moment to be seen together. The air outside was cooler than it had been the day before, and as I walked to my car, I noticed how steady my steps were, how natural it felt to move forward without hesitation. I sat behind the wheel and placed my hands gently on it, not starting the engine right away. Instead, I allowed myself a moment to think, not about what had been done, but about what would come next. Because now I understood something important. This was not just about taking money. It was about rewriting authority, about quietly shifting control from one place to another while making it appear reasonable, even helpful. That required planning. It required patience. And most importantly, it required the belief that I would not resist. That belief was their greatest mistake. I started the car and drove home, following the same familiar route, but this time, everything felt sharper, more defined. The stoplights, the passing cars, the quiet rhythm of the road. It all seemed to move in sync with something inside me that had settled into clarity. When I arrived, I did not go inside immediately. I stood for a moment in the driveway, looking at the house Harold and I had built together, the place where every decision had once been shared, discussed, understood. That had not changed. What had changed was who believed they had the right to decide its future. Inside, the house greeted me with the same quiet stillness, but it no longer felt like something had been taken from it. It felt like something was waiting. I walked into the kitchen and picked up the envelope again, holding it between my fingers, examining it as if it were something distant, something that no longer defined the situation but revealed it. Then I set it down carefully and moved to the study. I opened the drawer, took out the notebook, and began writing again. Not emotions, not reactions, facts, dates, names, entities, the limited liability company, the transfer timeline, the signatures, each detail placed exactly where it belonged. This was no longer a story being told to me. It was a record I was building myself. As I wrote, I considered their position. Sophia had taken the lead, that much was clear. The structure, the coordination, the confidence, it all pointed to her. But Daniel had allowed it. Whether through silence or agreement, he had stepped into a role that required his participation. That mattered, not because it changed how I felt about him, but because it defined the situation as it truly was. This was not confusion. This was alignment. When I finished writing, I closed the notebook and placed it back in the drawer, aligning it carefully with the others. Then I stood and walked slowly through the house, room by room, not searching for anything, but reminding myself of what was still mine. The living room where Harold used to read in the evenings. The dining table where we had shared countless quiet meals. The window where the afternoon light always fell just right across the floor. Nothing here had changed. Not yet. And that meant I still had time. Later that afternoon, my phone buzzed with a message from Sophia. Simple, polite, carefully worded. She asked if I would like to come over for dinner later that week. Said it would be good to spend time together, to keep things feeling normal. I read the message once, then again, noting the phrasing, the tone, the intention behind it. Normal. That was the word she had chosen. As if normal was something that could be restored simply by sitting at the same table, by sharing a meal, by continuing a version of events that had already been decided. I set the phone down without replying immediately and walked back to the window, looking out at the yard, at the trees that moved gently in the breeze. They believed everything was still within their control, that the structure they had built was stable, unquestioned, complete. But structures built on assumptions have a way of shifting when those assumptions are no longer true. I picked up the phone again and typed a response, my words simple, my tone warm, exactly as expected. I told her dinner sounded lovely, that I would be happy to come. Then I set the phone aside and allowed myself a small, quiet breath. Not relief, not hesitation, just acknowledgement. Because now, for the first time since this began, I was not stepping into their version of events. I was stepping into mine.